Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Now Mary Smith, we know that's an alias, right? She hasn't been willing to tell me what her real name is. So, how is life in the witness protection program? Is it good? That's good. Let me say a few words about this Association of Governing Boards of Universities and Colleges, which is working with the Higher Education Coordinating Board here to help put on your session today and tomorrow. So this Association of Governing Boards is pretty much what it sounds like. It's a membership association of institutions focused on the work that their trustees do. And they have an annual conference. They publish newsletters and magazines. They have now something called AGBU, which is a series of videos that people have done on specific topics that trustees have to tangle with. So if you're at all interested, I'd urge you to go to agb.org and you can take a look at the services they offer. The consulting group that I'm really here as part of, working with Mary and colleagues at the board, do things like work with trustees meetings like we're doing here today, facilitate board retreats, do presidential evaluations for boards, mediate conflicts, work with strategic planning for boards and their chief executives. So it's an interesting kind of organization that I thought you should be aware of. And by the way, Juliet Garcia, whom many of you will know or know the name of, is on the board of the Association of Governing Boards now. So it indeed has its own board as well. Quick word on my background so you can kind of get a sense of my perspective as I talk about these responsibilities that you have in your roles. I've worked with higher education boards in one way or another my whole career. Started out with the New York State Board of Regents, which is a coordinating board that in that state has responsibility for K-12 as well as higher ed, the licensed professions in New York. It was established in 1784. Got very sweeping powers back then, that is, many of which it's held on to. John Jay was one of the first members of the Board of Regents in New York. I then worked for the SUNY system, State University of New York system, as associate provost, but then as secretary of the university, which is the corporate officer who staffed the SUNY Board of Trustees, and then for almost 10 years worked as the CEO of the University of Wisconsin system, very closely with the University of Wisconsin Board of Regents in that system. I've never been to Austin before, so it's a great opportunity to visit your fair city. And I was thinking that Austin and Madison, my home's in Madison, Wisconsin, may have some things in common. You know, they're both capital cities. Neither is the largest city in their state. They both have the big research university campus, and a former governor of Wisconsin, a guy by the name of Lee Sherman Dreyfus, who interestingly, was the chancellor of the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point and ran for governor and got elected. He used to like to describe Madison as 30 square miles surrounded by reality. So I hear that some people outside of Austin and Texas think of Austin that way, so maybe we have that in common. We have 45 minutes for this session. I'm going to try to talk about 25 and then open it up for dialogue, because I think that will be the best way for us to learn today. So let me run through some things. There's a new publication out from this Association of Governing Boards called Consequential Boards, and it makes some assertions. Here's one of them. The premises behind, oh, and by the way, this Consequential Boards publication was developed by a special commission of folks, very reputable folks, most of them trustees from around the country, that AGB called together to look at the issues for trustees in colleges and universities going forward. It's published in 2014. Charles Miller, former chair of the UT board here, was on this commission that came up with the Consequential Boards report. One of the things they said, the premises behind shared governance have been disconnected from its practices at most institutions. Respect for a delineation of roles among boards, presidents, and faculty members has broken down in what some observers call role drift. Some boards have moved into institutional management and academic policy, even as others have disengaged. Faculty members increasingly want to exercise veto rights over fiscal decisions. Legislators and governors, in turn, want to get involved in articulation agreements, transfer policies, and policies for awarding academic credit. One interesting set of assertions. Then a different kind of topic. Board culture is central to board effectiveness. It is the accumulation of traditions and habits of work that have developed over time through both written and unwritten rules that guide behavior. So Gertrude Stein, who was an early 20th century American modernist writer, lived in Paris most of her life, used to like to define culture as how we do everything around here. And each board has a culture about how they do everything around their board. So again, this is a citation of the report from the National Commission on College and University Board Governance. What I'd like to do is this. As I run through these responsibilities, have you think a little bit, as I'm making my remarks, about whether your board, as best you can tell, and I know many of you are relatively new trustees, but as best you can tell, would be adequately characterized by some of the quotes that I just read or not. And if so, why? If not, why not? And what difference, given your answer, what difference does that make for your role as a trustee? So let's look directly at some of these responsibilities now. And what follows here really is kind of the accumulated wisdom of AGB on essential responsibilities of boards. It's kind of a compendium of best practices, if you will, for boards as articulated by AGB and as filtered a bit through my own experience. That doesn't make it right. So if you disagree with any of these responsibilities or the way they're stated, please, when we get to the conversation part of the session today, let's have that conversation, because we may not have it right on all of these. And part of the interesting thing about the jobs you have, as you're discovering, is each institution is different. Each board is different. And in the case of AGB, they have not only public colleges and universities as members, they have private colleges and universities as members too. So it's really hard to say something that's true for that whole universe and right for that whole universe. So we'll see how this resonates with your institutions. Boards have ultimate fiduciary responsibility to their institutions. And kind of obvious to say, I think there are two core pieces to that fiduciary responsibility. The board is there to ensure that the institution's meeting its mission. Do you know the mission of the board? Do you have an elevator speech? If somebody said, what's the mission of University X where you're a trustee? Probably a good thing to have that in mind as a little elevator speech. Sometimes the board needs to change the mission, if that needs to change in the board's wisdom. But you should have a deep understanding and feel for what the mission is, and your decisions should be placed in the framework of that mission always. Second big fiduciary responsibility, I think, is to ensure the longer-term longevity of the institution, its longer-term viability. Are you helping the leadership of the institution and the stakeholders to look forward in an adequate way so that it's ready to meet the challenges that are coming down the pipeline, challenges in fulfilling its mission on out through the future. Boards are responsible for the recruitment, compensation, performance review of the president of the institution. Most trustees I've worked with will say that's our most important job, is getting the right CEO, overseeing the work of the CEO, evaluating it, helping him or her to improve, that's the most important thing we do. And I think that is true. I'd agree with that. The board broadly defines the educational mission of the institution, determines generally the academic programs of the institution, and is ultimately accountable for the quality of the learning experience. So mission, programs, quality. Mission, programs, quality. I think those three words should be at the core of your consciousness as a trustee. Your boards are overseers of the public trust they hold and need to be accountable for meeting the public trust in ways that are appropriate to the mission of the institution. These are public positions, and your board will be involved, if it hasn't already, with you on it, in making some hard decisions that people will disagree with. And you will take some shots as a result of your willingness to be a trustee at a public college or university. And that's part of this accountability. You're in the middle of what can sometimes be an intense public dialogue, right? And then some of you who've been around for a while, I know, have felt the heat on some occasions around those kinds of controversies that your institution may have gotten involved in. I think if you are accountable and are transparent, though, and can explain the decisions, people, even if they strongly disagree, will respect the decisions over time. Sometimes it doesn't feel like they're being very respectful right at the moment. But and these are people sometimes inside the institution as well as external stakeholders. But transparency and accountability, really important part of fulfilling that very public trust that you hold. Boards are responsible for ensuring the independence of the institution and for safeguarding academic freedom. Independence and academic freedom. The analogy I like to use on this is to say boards, I think, need to be both buffers and conduits. So sometimes it will be your role to buffer for the people inside the institution who need to get on doing their important work, teaching, research, outreach, buffer them from outside influence, interference. Some of our colleagues in the first panel made this point, I think, this morning. At other times, I think a board needs to be a bit of a conduit, needs to let some of the heat in to move the institution, and doing that in a way that's strategic with your president or chancellor can be an important role. You know, part of the reason you are where you are is to bring an outside perspective to the institution where you serve as a trustee. And sometimes you're going to need to press that. Sometimes you're going to say, wait a minute, these folks on the inside need to go on and get on with their work. I'll take the heat on this one and let them do that. Without academic freedom, there is no university. You might as well shut the doors and go home. And it's really important that trustees understand that and know how to defend it appropriately. It's equally important, I might say, that people inside the institution, faculty most notably, understand something about that and exercise that academic freedom appropriately and judiciously. I'll give you a negative example. In the last couple months, one of my faculty colleagues at the University of Wisconsin-Madison made an analogy between the governor and Adolf Hitler. This caused all sorts of a stir, as you can imagine, and in her point of view, well, this was just part of my academic freedom. It means I can say what I think. Well, yeah, it means you should be able to propound your discipline and what it has to say to the world in ways that you understand it. It doesn't mean you can and should say anything that you damn well please. So I was pleased to see how we handle that, the main part of it being the executive committee of the faculty senate at the Madison campus issued a statement saying they didn't think this was the appropriate exercise of academic freedom. And I thought that was exactly the right way to handle that. So that's an area that, you know, can get very touchy, and boards need to understand their role in that regard. Boards define the terms of shared governance within their institutions through respect for traditions of shared governance, including delegation of recommendations for academic policy to faculty. So this shared governance thing is unlike anything that goes on in any other kind of organization, really, that I think most of us are familiar with. And it's a constant back and forth between yourselves as trustees, yourselves as presidents and CEOs, I know we have a couple of those in the room, and the people inside the academy, fully inside the faculty and staff, and the students very often getting involved with this. A point I'll make is that boards and the CEO have the final fourth in the back and forth. That is, shared governance does not mean shared decision-making on every item. Why not? Well, for one reason, there'll be items where people will disagree, and you can't come to a shared decision, and somebody has to make one and take the blows for making one that we talked about earlier. And that will be the chancellor or the president with your support, hopefully. But, you know, I'd urge you to exercise that final say when it comes to shared governance in the spirit of what Justice Felix Frankfurter called the 4 freedoms of the university. He said that these are the 4 freedoms that universities have in this country. To determine for itself on academic grounds, 1, who may teach, 2, what may be taught, 3, how it should be taught, and 4, who may be admitted to study. Who may teach, what may be taught, how it should be taught, and who may be admitted to study. Now, boards typically delegate those decisions to faculty and administration, at the same time retaining oversight of them and the right to intervene if the institution is going off the rails because poor decisions are being made. But that is a delicate back and forth dance. The ultimate authority on all 4 of those freedoms rests with the Board of Trustees to protect and defend, but the Board of Trustees, again, because these are academic matters, typically delegates them for their operations to faculty, staff, administration at the institution, retaining the final right to intervene as necessary. Boards make decisions about finance, including the approval of the budget, and we just had a very good presentation about that I think will be helpful to you. Establishment of guidelines for the allocation of resources and strategic financial planning as an element of their role in strategic planning. So this is about following the money, as we like to say, and determining if you're comfortable about where the money is going. That's part of your role as a trustee, and following the money in these institutions. Ronnie and I were just talking, it's really hard, right? I mean, it's not neat. The revenue streams, the cost centers are complex, and it's not a clear pathway to follow, but you need to get skilled in doing that. And I'll talk more a little bit about that in the 1045 session on monitoring and oversight, so I won't spend a lot of time on it here. Number 8, boards are responsible for reaching out to multiple constituencies, internal and external, to maintain a respectful and open flow of communication between relevant stakeholder groups. Now, who are those stakeholder groups, right? You got students, you got faculty, you got staff, you got alumni, you got donors, you have prospective donors, you have athletics boosters, you have governors, you have legislators, you have mayors, you have business leaders, you have nonprofit leaders, you have community leaders, you have the media, you have perhaps more than ever the federal government in play here, and on and on and on. So the point here, I think, is that the university is not a business with a defined customer base. It's more like a cult with a far-flung, eclectic group of believers who all believe something different about what the university ought to be doing. And you as trustees, you as the president or chancellor, are in the middle of all of that, of all of those stakeholders. And I think you're kind of the key set of what I'll call interlocutors that needs to be talking to all of those different stakeholders about what the university is doing, what the college is doing, what it needs to be doing, what it should be doing. You're kind of, I like to describe trustees as the innie-outie group. You know, some people have innie belly buttons, some people have outie belly buttons. Well, you need to have both, because people outside will see you as captured by the inside. People on the inside will see you as representative of all those pressure groups from outside that they wish would go away. That's kind of the role, and it's a tricky one. Number 9, boards need to understand the legal and regulatory environment within which their institution operates and ensure compliance with fiscal, academic, licensing, and other standards. This is not the glamorous part of it, and I think Mark will help us understand better this part of it when he talks, but it's basic, and it's so important. You know, we live in an age of transparency. We live in an era of distrust by the public of all institutions, not just universities. It's the government, it's business, it's the church, it's the university, and I think that's partly because we are so transparent. People can see all the warts now in a way they weren't able to not that long ago, and sometimes they get fixated on the warts, not the rest of the body, and we need to help them focus sometimes on the rest of the body. You need to help the president do that, but you need to do it by being transparent, admitting when there are mistakes, and making sure you go back to towing the line on those legal regulatory requirements. And if you don't, the brand of your institution will be mightily damaged at some point. And that goes back to that initial fiduciary responsibility about ensuring the long-term viability of your institution. Part of that is keeping the recognition and the good feeling about the brand of your institution high, and you've got to pay attention to that stuff to do that. Number 10, conduct the board's business in an exemplary fashion and with appropriate transparency, there it is again, adhering to the highest ethical standards and complying with the applicable open meeting and public records laws, ensure the currency of board governance policies and practices, and periodically assess the performance of the board, its committees, and its members. There's a whole lot of stuff in there, and we don't have time to talk about all of it this morning. Just on the last one, this idea of having periodically a board self-assessment or assessment, I mean, that's a good practice in my experience, more honored in the breach than in the keeping. And why is that? Well, I think it's kind of hard for boards to do this. I mean, who assesses them? Well, they have to assess themselves at some level. And this is, you know, I recognize, most of us who work with you do, who are administrators in your institutions, this is an unpaid job that you have. And you give huge numbers of hours and time and energy to do this, and we thank you for that. So, but how do you do an assessment to make sure you're on the right track as a board, as an individual trustees? I'll just put in a pitch again to say AGB does do that. They have experienced people who have worked with boards to do self-assessments and do them in a public environment, right? I mean, one of the tricks here is not to do a self-assessment and you're a public university, and again, every wart is shoved under the nose of the media in the state for them to write about for the next 3 months. These need to be done very carefully, but if you can do them, they can be very important and formative and useful for you as individuals and for your institution, like any good organization. I'm going to skip over this. I think we've covered a lot of it. Let me finish up my formal remarks here, and then we'll open it up for some conversation about the board and president partnership. And again, it goes back to the notion that hiring and cultivating the leadership career of your CEO is probably the most important thing you do as a board member. I think some of the elements of this is having clear expectations, the board of the president and the president of the board. It is a mutual, or should be a mutual set of expectations, and they should be clear. I think they should be laid out clearly what those expectations are year by year at the beginning of the year of the performance cycle in a document that you agree on. And then there should be some assessment of the performance after that year goes by based on your assessment of how that president is doing. Now again, in a public environment, you've got to be really careful about what is available to the press to write about or not, and different states have different laws about what you can do in executive session or not, and I don't know the Texas laws, but you've got to know them and do any assessment like this very, very carefully. And it's got to be mutual in the sense that the president needs to be able to say to the board, all right, you know, I hear what you're saying about my performance. I want to talk a little bit about how helpful you've been, and in other areas where I think you could be more helpful in the future, to put it politely. So that assessment, if it's done right on the clear expectations, will be to some extent an assessment of the board as well as an assessment of the president, if it's done right. I think the next three pieces here are of a piece: a common sense of purpose, a shared vision, and a mutually agreed upon plan. Number 4 needs to be what you use to implement number 3 and number 2. And number 4, that plan, that strategic plan, as you might call it, needs to have some strategies and some tactics about how to get to that purpose, how to actually make that vision come real. It's got to have some metrics, got to have some numbers that you can track with your president about how the institution under her or his leadership is doing in that regard. And then the last thing, a commitment to inclusion by all stakeholders. These partners, the president and the board, both as a group the board, and as individuals, will be judged by all the stakeholders, in no small part by the nature of this relationship. And when that relationship goes south, especially in a public institution, you've got a problem, and it's a problem the media loves to focus on, and you've had some examples of that in this state recently. And it's not good for the institution when that happens. Some broad conversations on the part of trustees with stakeholders are fine. Others are not so good. Let me give you an example by what I mean around this issue of stakeholders and communication. It is all about communication in this partnership between the board and the president with those stakeholders surrounding you all, watching what you're doing. So if you as a trustee go to the vice president for finance, right, and say, well, how do you think President Riley's really doing? You know, how do you think he's doing? Is that okay?
You should say fabulous.
What's that?
You should say fabulous.
Say what?
You should say fabulous.
Fabulous. I should say fabulous. But that's the point in a way. So when you do that as a trustee, you put the vice president for finance in a very difficult, awkward position, because she wants to be loyal to you as a trustee of her institution, and if it's working right, she wants to be loyal to the president. Now, if you're kind of implying maybe you think things aren't going so well with President Riley, I think the way to handle that is to go to the board chair, have a conversation with him or her, and decide what kind of conversation you and the board chair together, or the board chair might have with President Riley about your concern. So there are some sensitive do's and don'ts around this partnership to make it work well, and that's just one example. So it's 10:15. We have 15 minutes left. I'm going to stop there. I have many more slides if you want me to go on that I can force feed, but I'd much rather open it up and have a good conversation now, and we can talk a little bit about, you know, in those initial, let me go back to that initial quote from Consequential Board so we have it in front of us and see if you think this describes your board or not, but we don't have to focus the conversation on that. Let's talk about what's on your minds.
I'd like to know what you think about, I know you put a lot of emphasis on these assessments, self-assessments by the board and by the president of the board and that sort of thing. And assessments, by necessity, sometimes have to be critical. And I don't know about Wisconsin, but in Texas, every document that's produced by a public entity becomes subject to public scrutiny by the media and everybody else. And sometimes people are reluctant to create those kinds of documents that may be critical of either board members or the president, for fear that the media or some of those, quote, stakeholders can gain access to those and use them in a way in which they were not intended to be used.
Right. It's a great question, and one of the things that we all struggle with working in the kind of fishbowl that we do. So I can tell you, really based on my experience in Wisconsin, what we did, and it sounds like it's a similar environment. So even personnel evaluations in Wisconsin, if you are the CEO of any government entity, so if you're the secretary of the Department of Revenue and the governor does some kind of evaluation of you, that's open to the public, the written document. It was the same case for me as president of the system. It was the same case for my evaluations of the chancellors in the system. So what we would try to do was to write documents with that possibility in mind, thinking if this got out tomorrow and the press wanted to turn it into a salacious headline, would it be easy? And we didn't, unless we wanted to fire the chancellor, we didn't want that to happen. So at the beginning, again, beginning of the year, you write a set of goals. And then when the year goes by, in my case, I'd sit down with the president and vice president of the board, and we'd have a conversation about how they thought I was doing on my goals. And then at the next board meeting, we could go into executive session to talk about that. And I'd meet with them and the full board, and everybody would have a chance to look at what I had written and what the board chair told them we had talked about. And then the board chair would write a kind of final document evaluation based on the expectations they had of me, the initial document at the front of the year, and the conversations that went on. But again, being very careful not to say, boy, this, on this issue, he really did a terrible job. Here are the 5 ways he did it wrong, right? If they wanted to say something like that, they said it verbally. And that was a private meeting that we were allowed to do under the law in Wisconsin. So I think you can walk a fine line in doing this and not just say, well, we can't do it. But you do have to be careful and think about what happens if this gets out. And there was, not when I was president, but when I was a chancellor in the system, there was a chancellor who had one of these 360s done, where anybody on the campus, can weigh in on email about what they think of the president's performance in that year, in this case, the chancellor's. Well, that, as it turned out, was available under the press, and the press got a hold of it. And, you have people saying all sorts of crazy things who understand, that much of the president's job, and the president's job is here. So that is not, we stopped doing 360s in the University of Wisconsin after that. And as it turned out, that chancellor left fairly shortly afterwards because it really poisoned the environment for him. Good question. Others? Yeah, Susan.
Thank you. Do you have any, I'm Suzanne Shipley, President, Midwestern State University. Do you have any guidance for us board members who have children enrolled at the university while the board member is serving on the board?
Yeah. It's interesting and tough, and I think at one level it can really inform your service because you, on a regular basis, might be getting feedback about what it feels like to be a student that you don't normally if you're a trustee and you don't have that connection. But I think you always have to keep in mind, as I think Scott said in the first panel, that when you step into that boardroom, you're not there as Joanne's parent. You're there as a regent or a trustee of the institution, and you have to think about the welfare of the entire institution. Interesting anecdote from my experience. So a couple years ago, we always had one student on the University of Wisconsin board. A couple of years ago, the legislature, with our support, passed a statute that said we had to have 2, and the second one had to be an adult student because of the increasing presence of adult students on all of our campuses. And at one point, we had a terrific regent who was a middle-aged woman who hadn't gone to college, had owned her own trucking company with her husband, had a family, and was now back in school. So she was the adult student regent, and her daughter was at another campus in the system. And that really worked out very well, partly because of who she was, and she kind of knew the rule that I just articulated in response to your question. But I think it's part of that larger piece of when you're a regent, you're not there representing your daughter who's a student. You're not there representing the alumni group that you got along with when you were a student at that institution. You're not representing the institution that your mother graduated from. You're representing the institution or all the institutions in the system in a very broad way as somebody who's trying to do that fiduciary role, right? What can I contribute to this institution meeting its mission, vital public mission for the people of Texas, and how can I ensure it's nimble looking to the future so that it can continue to meet that vital public need well into the future. And if you keep those kinds of things up front, I think you'll be all right. And again, there are some benefits, I think, to having those kinds of direct connections as well. Why don't you tell me, where you're from, who you are, where you're from?
David Beck, University of Texas Board of Regents. You had mentioned freedom of speech earlier, and there seems to be a growing trend in this country to deny speakers access to a campus if some on campus don't happen to agree with their views or their position in government, et cetera. I guess, are you aware of any instances where boards of regents injected themselves into that issue. So I guess what I'm looking for is what role, if any, do you see a board of regents playing when that issue surfaces?
Yeah, I'm trying to think recently, and I think you're right about the trend, and I think it's a bad trend.
Yeah, fortunately, we haven't had to deal with it,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I'm convinced it's coming.
It probably is. I don't, maybe others in the room will, I don't recall any fairly recent incidents where boards have interjected themselves into it. I think it's generally been handled, I'm sure any president or chancellor worth her or his salt is consulting with the board president, vice president, others on the board when these kinds of things come up. But I think most of the ones that I've seen have been handled one way or the other by the president or the chancellor. There's a very famous instance where a board did inject itself into this in the late 1800s when the Wisconsin Board of Regents issued this statement that said, regardless, and this is a paraphrase, regardless of strictures which may prohibit speech elsewhere, the great state university of Wisconsin, as they call themselves then, shall always back the fearless and continuing sifting and winnowing without which the truth cannot be known. There's a plaque that says that, and that was a statement by the Board of Regents. They were a professor who was kind of a left-wing professor back then, had gotten into conflict with some folks on the other side, and there was a call to fire him, and they did get involved, and they issued that statement, which is kind of a statement that has echoed down, for those of us in the business, has echoed down through many, many years. So will it be necessary for boards to get involved in this issue? I think it might well, as you're suggesting, maybe as you're fearing, because I think the pressure is building on all sides around this issue on campuses of who can say what to whom, who speaks for whom. And I think decisions that chancellors or presidents made will be more and more criticized, will be more and more criticized, and they'll be looking to board members to back them. And again, that means early on, if you feel these things are brewing, through your board leadership, having a conversation with the CEO and saying, well, how do you think you're going to handle this? We want to be supportive. How are you going to handle it? Let's have a private conversation about what I think about how you're going to handle it. So I think, look, in terms of risk management, looking forward that way is really wise. Yeah.
In the follow-on to the question that you just asked, is there, what would be your opinion on a board being assumptive about we need to deal with this problem even before it comes up and ask the CEO to develop a policy in advance of it happening so that you're not stunned when something comes up, or having a public discussion about why this guy could or could not come to the campus, because we've already got a rule about how it works. And if your institution doesn't already have a policy like that, I mean, can the board, without violating all the things you guys are concerned about, could the board, ask somebody, would you please come up with a policy on this so we don't have to deal with it in the press publicly later on?
Yeah. An ounce of prevention's worth a pound of cure, right? No, I think you can, and I think every institution should have a policy on this. Most of them, in my experience, do. But if you go back to your institution and find it doesn't, I think it should have one that you can say, well, let's get one in place that deals with our policy on outside speakers coming to campus. Most institutions, as part of that policy, will have some rules of behavior around political candidates coming in a campaign. I mean, there are all sorts of other angles to this, but there should be a policy in place. The board should approve that policy. If the institution you find has a policy, but as you look at it, you think it's inadequate for the times, given the kind of pressure that we're feeling on this issue, might be time to revise it. So no, I think that's absolutely within your purview. What's not in your purview is to say, look, I'm an X and that guy's a Y, and I don't want these Ys speaking on our campus. That's not what you should do. One more? Yeah, yes.
You know, you talked about branding. I had made a comment at our last Regents meeting on branding and trying to make sure we're not don't do things that damage the brand. Same time, and this kind of ties back to your comment on 360s, but there's another thing out there we haven't mentioned when you talk about managing universities' reputation or brand. It's this whole social media piece, and now you've got things that can be injected from anywhere.
Yeah.
When you talked about people who know this much on the continuum of the full arm spread. Any recommendations for boards on dealing with social media, especially because I'm still undecided about what happened at University of Missouri, as an example. And I'll just leave it at that. I'm undecided about what happened there.
Yeah. Really good question. And, I've been involved in leadership development in higher education, working with the American Council on Education, doing some sessions for people who are aspiring to be presidents and chancellors. We talk a lot about this. It used to be the advice was, well, get out ahead of the crisis. You really need to have your intelligence out there before the thing breaks. Gone. Those days are gone. Most of the crises, there will be hundreds of people on your campus who will know it before you know it, and it will clobber you because those people will start to send emails and other things over the transom at you. So there's no easy way to handle this. I think having a really good communications director who's savvy about this stuff, which probably means he or she's under 40, is really important. But having somebody who can monitor what's going on out there in social media on a regular basis is really necessary, I think, to have any hope of responding. And then having a crisis plan, crisis communications plan as part of that, and having a team that you call together when all of a sudden you get 100 emails saying, you know what happened down on the south side of campus today? You get them in place right away. You have the right people on that team. You have somebody who can say, all right, what's the social media been sounding like? How's it trending? And how do we respond now? And you do still need to respond relatively quickly when you don't have all the facts usually. You need to be as factually accurate as you can. You need to acknowledge that you don't have all the facts nonetheless, and then keep that crisis team running in place with you for as long as it takes to get the crisis dampened down. But that's all easy to say, and in the social media world, just so hard to do. And part of the problem, right, is that stuff that gets out there first and gets repeated becomes fact very quickly, even though it may be totally not factual. It may be partly factual, maybe entirely factual. But you won't know when you first have to talk about it. And a lot of other people will be absolutely convinced, they won't know either, but they'll be absolutely convinced it's absolute fact or it's all wrong. And you'll be in the middle of that. Tough thing to be in the middle of, but that's when, again, your presidents and chancellors really will need your support.